When we look back on historic fascist regimes, we see oppressive, destructive, autocratic governments whose leaders personify some of the very worst in humanity. But they did not arrive as monsters, they arrived as saviours, promising to restore order to nations that they claimed had been weakened from within. By the time the fear, violence and repression became too much to ignore, the very system that was supposed to limit them had already been twisted to their benefit. So how were these leaders able to exploit their democracies to amass unmitigated power? And why does a society willingly hand over power to a government that will crush its freedoms? In this video, we'll not only define what fascism is, but we'll take a technical look at how fascist movements were able to come to power in the first place. Today, the word fascist is often used as a catch-all term for harsh or repressive politics, but historically, fascism has a more specific meaning. Even the etymology of the word itself tells us something. It comes from the Latin fasces, a bundle of rods surrounding an axe carried in ancient Rome as a symbol of authority, discipline and punishment. Historians have long argued about exactly how fascism should be defined, but most agree it is a specific form of revolutionary, ultranationalist politics. Not every repressive government is fascist, but they do have some recurring features which, when appearing together, form what can reasonably be described as fascist regimes. These features include, but are not limited to, extreme nationalism, a hostility to democracy, and a single leader presented as the one and only answer. Fascism celebrates discipline and obedience whilst glorifying strength and violence. It creates enemies from within and uses fear and conspiratorial thinking to justify harsh measures. Fascism uses rallies, rituals and propaganda to encourage mass participation and make conformity seem normal. A fascist government also wants to control courts, media, education and other institutions that might limit its power. To explain how this works in practice, it helps to look at the two most well-known fascist regimes in Europe, Fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini and Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. Now, they were not identical and their rise took place about a decade apart, but their paths to power reveal several striking similarities that allow us to identify a pattern. Fascist movements rise in moments when large numbers of people feel that the old system has failed. Economic collapse and social unrest often create the perfect conditions for a movement promising strength and order. On a human level, that means hunger, unemployment, and the sense that life is getting worse while established politics offers no real answers. That's when a fascist politician can come along and capitalise. In Italy, the First World War left behind economic ruin and unemployment, and there was a sense that the country had been cheated of the rewards that it was promised. In Germany, the Great Depression devastated the economy and shattered faith in the Weimar Republic. In both countries, the fascists turned these crises into political fuel. This is where the cult of personality matters. Mussolini and Hitler presented themselves as decisive men of action, in contrast to weak, fragmented parliamentary politics. They claimed that they alone could turn things around, restore national pride, and lead their countries into a new era of strength. But charisma alone was not enough. Both movements also used organised violence. Mussolini's black shirts beat and terrorised socialists, trade unionists and local opponents, while Hitler's brown shirts did something similar in Germany. They leaned into it and used the chaos as part of their argument for handing more power to the very people helping to create the chaos. Neither man seized power alone, both were enabled by higher-ups who believed that they could be used and controlled. In Italy, Mussolini was appointed Prime Minister by the King after his march on Rome, while in Germany, Hitler was appointed Chancellor within a coalition government. In both cases, traditional elites thought they could control the extremists. They were wrong. Once in office, fascist leaders don't necessarily abolish the existing legal system immediately. Instead, they manipulate them. They use the language of emergency to turn extraordinary measures into permanent tools of rule. In Germany, the Reichstag fire in February 1933 was used as the pretext for an emergency decree that suspended key civil liberties, including the freedom of expression, assembly, press, and due process. The decree was presented as a temporary protection, but instead it became a foundation of Hitler's dictatorship. Soon after came the Enabling Act, which allowed Hitler's cabinet to legislate without parliament, destroying the constitutional balance from within. In Italy, Mussolini's government used electoral engineering and later emergency laws to do something similar, but over a slightly longer period of time. The Acerbo law skewed the electoral system in favour of the largest party, helping the fascists secure a commanding parliamentary majority. Then came the Matteotti crisis. It began in 1924 when the socialist Giacomo Matteotti publicly denounced fascist violence and electoral fraud. He was then abducted in broad daylight and brutally murdered by a fascist squad. The killing shocked Italy, but rather than bringing Mussolini down, it empowered him. In a speech on the 3rd of January 1925, he challenged his critics to stop him if they could, taking political responsibility for fascist violence and signalling that open intimidation would now define the regime. None of Mussolini's dissenters wanted to share the same fate as Matteotti, and the subsequent Leggi Fascistissime laws passed with ease. These new laws essentially transformed Mussolini's government into a dictatorship. They crushed opposition parties, restricted press freedom, strengthened censorship and policing, and so concentrated power in the hands of the fascist state. The Enabling Act and the Leggi Fascistissime show us that the fascists did not simply break the law, they remade it. By turning their will into law, they gave their dictatorships authority and further cemented their individual control over their nations. Once emergency powers are secured, the next step is to make sure that every institution, public or private, either serves the regime or can no longer resist it. Courts, police, civil servant, local government, schools, cultural bodies, and even private businesses are all pressured into line. In Italy, the fascist regime used its laws to remove officials who weren't loyal and replaced locally elected mayors with appointed podesta, tightening control from the centre. In Germany, the process known as Gleichschaltung or coordination brought the states, civil service and public institutions into line with Nazi rule. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service purged many officials on racial and political grounds and helped turn the state bureaucracy into an instrument of Nazi ideology. Democracy depends on institutions that have their own legitimacy and independence. Fascist regimes survive by making sure those institutions no longer answer to the law, but to the ruling movement itself. Fascism doesn't rely on force alone. It also depends on controlling what people believe. Independent journalism and intellectualism are dangers to a movement that's built on myth and obedience. However, fascist regimes might instead cultivate their own approved scholars and cultural figures to give their ideology an air of legitimacy. In Italy, the press was tightly supervised by the Ministry of Popular Culture. In Germany, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine coordinated newspapers, radio, film and culture, while censorship and book burning signalled that there would be no safe space for independent thought. Mass rallies, uniforms, symbols, salutes and marches all helped create this sense that the regime was inevitable and all-powerful. And these tactics worked because many people found them impressive and made them feel part of a whole. Fascism used the individual's own longing for purpose to cultivate conformity. A key part of this propaganda was demonization. Fascist politics often explains complex problems through a simple premise, with one group blamed for everything and one solution hailed as the answer. In Nazi Germany, this was made brutally apparent through anti-Semitism. Jews were portrayed as an all-purpose existential threat, accused of undermining the economy and conspiring against the German nation. Nazi anti-Semitism was also explicitly racial. Jews represented a biological danger, said to be corrupting German blood and weakening the racial future of the nation. For the Nazis, Germany's future was made to seem reliant on the removal of Jewish people. At this stage, the regime tries to control every aspect of society. Secret police became central. In Italy, the OVRA monitored, intimidated and repressed dissidents, while in Germany, the Gestapo became synonymous with fear, surveillance and arbitrary arrest. People no longer needed to be punished publicly because the knowledge that they might be punished was enough. Youth organisations also mattered because fascism thinks about the long term. In Italy, young people were channeled into fascist youth structures such as the Opera Nazionale Balilla. In Germany, the Hitler Youth trained obedience, discipline and ideological loyalty from an early age. Economic life was also brought to heel. Independent trade unions were broken. Labour conflict was criminalised or absorbed into state-controlled structures. In Italy, this took the form of corporatist organisation, while in Germany, trade unions were destroyed and replaced by the German Labour Front. The idea was to subordinate economic life to the goal of the regime. In practice, systems like these also became fertile ground for corruption, with those close to power often preaching sacrifice while accepting bribes and enjoying their own elevated station. Despite their differences, both regimes followed the same broad pattern. A national crisis was exploited politically. A charismatic leader was elevated above ordinary politics. Opponents were recast as enemies to the nation. Violence was normalised and democratic mechanisms were used against democracy. Then, once the system had been remade around the leader and the movement, any kind of reversal became far harder. Both regimes also ended violently, particularly in the case of Mussolini, who was publicly hung and beaten in April 1945, where the same very radical and violent measures that once aided his ascent to power also spelled his own demise. At this point, it is worth making an important distinction that not every dictatorship is fascist, and not every authoritarian regime works in the same way. Secret police, censorship, imprisonment of opponents, and media repression are not unique to fascism. Many other autocracies have used similar tools, with communism perhaps bearing the most similarities. The differences, though, are absolutely key. Communism is organised around class, revolution, and the promise of a classless society, at least in theory, while fascism is organised around nation, hierarchy, exclusion, and rebirth. Fascist Italy and Germany lasted only until the deaths of their leaders, while the Soviet Union endured 8 different leaders over nearly 7 decades. Fascist regimes often become tethered to individual leaders as the ever-present embodiment of the nation itself, reproduced in portraits, slogans, and the naming of public spaces. That helped them to consolidate power, but it also created a situation where the leader was so intertwined with the regime that when they were no longer there, everything fell apart. In the same way that fasces are incomplete without the axe at their centre, without a leader, fascist governments are reduced to a bundle of sticks. But fascism is not sustained by leaders alone. It depends on the choices of officials, police, judges, business elite, media figures, neighbours, and ordinary citizens. It only becomes possible when enough people tolerate it. Without the sticks to support it, the fasces are no more than a blunt instrument.